You were born equipped with a creative power that transforms mental images into physical reality. The same divine intelligence that shapes everything in existence lives within you. No one ever taught you how to operate it. And there's a reason for that. In the early 20th century, an English judge named Thomas Troward developed the exact principles behind this mechanism. He had only one personal student, just one. Genevieve Behrend spent decades transmitting this knowledge, and yet it still remains on the margins. Why do you know 1,000 ways to spend your energy trying to change external circumstances, but you've never learned how to operate the power that creates them in the first place? The point isn't to acquire something you were missing. It's to recognize something that has always been there and that you've been using against yourself without even knowing it.
Look around you. Every object your eyes can reach, the chair where someone sits, the building that cuts across the horizon, the device through which these words are reaching you, they all share an identical origin. None of them appeared first in the material world. Every single one of them emerged as an image in someone's mind before taking on physical density. The hat was born in the imagination of the hat maker. The airplane lived in the thoughts of the Wright brothers before it ever cut through the clouds. Entire cities existed as architectural visions before the first stone was ever laid. This pattern has no known exceptions. Everything that carries physical form first passed through the invisible gateway of thought. If absolutely everything that exists in the human-built world originated as a mental image, what does that reveal about the nature of thought itself? Genevieve Behrend, the only personal student of Thomas Troward, the English judge whose Edinburgh lectures established the foundations of mental science, spent decades investigating precisely this question. In her 1921 work, Your Invisible Power, she presents a proposition that directly challenges the ordinary understanding of reality. The same creative power that brought the cosmos into existence operates through the human mind. The difference between the universal mind and the individual mind exists only in degree, never in nature. You don't need to acquire the power to create your reality. You already have it. The real question isn't about obtaining something you lack, but about recognizing what has always been present and learning to use it with deliberate awareness. Visualization, the formation and sustaining of clear mental images, operates as the mechanism through which the undifferentiated substance of the universe receives direction to take on specific form. It works as law. It produces results. The determining factor that separates those whose mental images materialize from those whose desires remain forever in the realm of someday doesn't depend on special talent, genetic inheritance, or exclusive divine favor. It depends on something anyone can develop: stable will, the ability to hold the mental image without introducing doubts, fears, or contradictory visions. The universal substance responds to the mental mold as light responds to a lens. It projects exactly what it finds. Most people visualize every single day. They visualize failure before the job interview. They visualize the argument with their partner before they even get home. They visualize illness when they feel an unfamiliar symptom. The human mind produces images constantly. This ability can't be turned off. What can be chosen is the direction of those images. Behrend establishes a fundamental distinction in Your Invisible Power. Visualization isn't a psychological technique invented by some modern thinker. It operates as a principle of the creative universe itself. The faculty of visualization, when exercised with deliberation, keeps the mind in order and naturally attracts the elements needed to expand one's life experience. When someone trains themselves to create specific mental images of their desires and carefully examines those images, their thoughts begin to flow in an orderly procession. What does orderly procession mean? The opposite of what characterizes most people's minds: the frantic jumping from one thought to another, the mental rush that accompanies fear, the agitation that precedes every form of internal destruction. A disordered mind projects contradictory images, wanting wealth in the morning, fearing poverty in the afternoon, and doubting everything at night. The universal substance receives these conflicting molds and can't produce a defined form from them. The central principle works like this. When understanding grasps the power to visualize the heart's desire and sustains it through the will, it attracts all things necessary for the fulfillment of that image. The mechanism of attraction works through harmonic vibrations. The mental image emits a specific frequency that finds its match in the undifferentiated substance. Beren establishes that order is the first law of heaven, and visualization places things in their natural order. To visualize represents an act of alignment with the very structure of the cosmos. Everyone visualizes. Consciously or unconsciously, every person forms mental images continuously. The difference between those who manifest their desires and those who perpetuate their frustrations doesn't lie in the presence or absence of the ability to visualize. It lies in the awareness and direction applied to that ability. Visualization is the great secret of success, not because it's hidden, but because very few understand that they're already practicing it all the time, usually against themselves. Berend illustrates this principle with a specific case. A woman needed to sell a property and couldn't find a buyer. After receiving instructions on how to form the mental image of the completed sale, she began to mentally walk through every detail exactly as she would if the property were already sold. She saw the signed contract. She saw the money in her hands. She saw herself free of that responsibility. One day, while walking down the street, a thought suddenly came to her to visit a specific real estate agent. There was no apparent logical reason for it. She hesitated. Her rational mind questioned the impulse. Still, she followed the intuition. The agent sold the property in 3 days. What happened in that interval? The sustained mental image created an alignment with the natural law of supply and demand. The woman didn't force the sale through multiplied external effort. She didn't convince anyone through argumentation. The intuitive impulse, that seemingly random thought about the agent, emerged as a direct consequence of the mental image she had maintained. The visualization didn't produce magic. It produced synchronicity operating through law. A mind trained to dismiss this kind of account as coincidence misses the pattern. When similar cases repeat, and Beren documents several throughout her work, the coincidence explanation requires more blind faith than the explanation by principle. To clarify how this works, Berend offers an analogy that deserves attention: the airplane. Human beings fly through the air, not because someone altered the laws of nature. They fly because the inventor learned to apply those laws and, making orderly use of them, produced the result they desired. The natural forces, gravity, aerodynamics, and propulsion have remained identical since the beginning of time. Airplanes didn't exist in year one, not because the laws were different, but because that generation couldn't conceive of the idea as a practical possibility. Thomas Troward, Berend's mentor, taught that the great lesson of the airplane and wireless telegraphy represents the triumph of principle over precedent. The development of an idea to its logical conclusion despite the contrary testimony accumulated from all past experience. For millennia, accumulated human experience testified that people don't fly. This precedent seemed unshakable until someone understood the underlying principle and demonstrated that the precedent was nothing more than collective ignorance disguised as impossibility. Visualization works the same way. The accumulated precedent of common experience suggests that thoughts are abstractions without causal power, that wishing for something doesn't produce it, that there's an insurmountable separation between the internal world of the mind and the external world of matter. This precedent dominates the collective consciousness, but precedent doesn't determine principle. The principle keeps operating regardless of how many people are unaware of it. Gravity didn't begin to exist when Newton described it. The law of attraction didn't start operating when someone gave it a name. It worked before, it works now, and it will work forever, whether it's recognized or ignored. The question you need to ask yourself isn't whether visualization works. The question is, what images are your mind projecting at this very moment? And what reality are they shaping without your conscious permission? There's a power within you that allows you to form thought images. This power is the starting point of absolutely everything that exists. Not some things, everything. Every form that occupies space in the physical universe first passed through this internal gateway. Behrend describes the original nature of this power. In its primordial state, it represents the undifferentiated and formless substance of life. Think of it as an infinite mass of possibilities that haven't been defined yet. It has no configuration of its own. It doesn't tend toward any specific direction. It waits, eternally available, for something to give it form. The thought image creates the mold. When you form a clear mental image and sustain it, you're essentially building an invisible container. The universal substance fills that container. It takes on the exact configuration of what you've molded internally. It doesn't question whether the mold is good or bad, whether the desire is noble or petty. It responds to the shape that's presented. Visualizing works as the condensing and specializing power of the mind. It takes what exists in a diffuse, potential, and unmanifested state and concentrates it in a specific direction. Behrend compares this process to a lens that focuses scattered light into a single point capable of generating intense heat. The light existed before. The lens didn't create it. It simply directed it with enough precision to produce a visible effect. And here we arrive at a central image in all of Behrend's work, perhaps the most useful for understanding the complete mechanism, the magic lantern. That old projection device that preceded cinema. It works like this. The slide represents the mental image you form. While it remains in the darkness of the lantern, no one can see it. It exists, but it doesn't manifest. For the image on the slide to appear on the external screen, something needs to happen. The light needs to be turned on. This light corresponds to the will. Illuminating the slide means activating the desire with absolute conviction that the creative spirit of life operates through you. Not vague hope, not desire mixed with doubt, conviction. When the steady flow of the light of will passes through the slide of the mental image, what was invisible projects itself onto the screen of the physical world. The reproduction appears exact. It corresponds precisely to the imagined slide. You're projecting something right now. The question is, do you know which slide is in your lantern? Behrend presents a case that demonstrates both the power and the pitfalls of this mechanism. A woman sought guidance because she wanted her husband, who had abandoned her, to return. The instruction was specific. Think of her husband as perfectly free and as the personification of everything a spouse should be. Don't try to control him mentally. Don't force anything. Hold the image of the restored and harmonious relationship. A few days later, she returned disturbed. Her husband had asked for a divorce to marry another woman. What went wrong? The analysis revealed the problem. When faced with the news of the divorce, she had relaxed her will. She allowed the image of her husband leaving to replace the image of her husband returning. She switched the slide. The lantern kept working, it always works, but now it was projecting a different image. After understanding her mistake and reaffirming her commitment to the original image, she maintained the visualization of her husband as the personification of the ideal spouse, without wavering in the face of contrary appearances. 2 months later, her husband came back. He asked for forgiveness. He declared that he had made a terrible mistake and that he couldn't be happy without her. What changed externally during that period? Nothing needed to change externally first. The internal change, the unwavering sustaining of the image, produced the corresponding external reorganization. This case exposes something most people prefer not to confront. The woman couldn't blame her husband, the circumstances, the other woman, or an unjust universe. The only moment when the manifestation failed was when she herself replaced the image. The only moment when it worked was when she kept it stable. There's no way to outsource this responsibility. Visualizing without a will stable enough to inhibit every thought and feeling contrary to the image would be as useless as a magic lantern without light. You can have the most perfect slide, the clearest image, and the most intense desire. If the light of will doesn't stay lit constantly, nothing gets projected. On the other hand, and this is the part that balances the equation, when the will develops enough to sustain the image in thought and feeling, without conditions, without ifs, without buts, simply recognizing that thought is the great attractive power, then the mental image projects itself onto the screen of the physical world, not as a possibility, as a certainty operating through law. The lantern doesn't fail. It has never failed. The universal projector is always running. The undifferentiated substance remains eternally available to take on any form presented to it. The variable isn't the mechanism. The variable is you. The slide you choose to place in the lantern, the consistency with which you keep the light on, the refusal to change the image when external appearances seem to contradict it. Your invisible power doesn't need to be acquired, developed, or earned. It needs to be recognized and operated with the precision that the law requires. If the mental image molds the universal substance and the will projects that image into the physical world, what exactly is the relationship between your individual mind and the universal mind that responds to your commands? Behrend offers an operational analogy. Think of a large telephone system. The main hub, the matrix of the entire network, subdivides into countless secondary hubs spread across different locations. Each secondary hub maintains a direct connection to the main hub. There's no intermediary, there's no cosmic bureaucracy. The line is always open. Each secondary hub, recognizing the source of its existence, reports everything back to its main hub. When it faces difficulties, needs new supplies, requires complex repairs, encounters problems that exceed its local capacity, the secondary hub immediately turns to the matrix. It wouldn't think of referring its issues to the hub of a telegraph system, even if that system belonged to the same general communications organization. Each system operates through its own source. You function as a secondary hub of the universal mind, not as a figure of speech, as an operational description. Your individual mind constitutes a localized point of operation of the infinite mind. It was projected from it. It remains connected to it. It can turn to it at any moment. The problem is that most people don't turn to it, or they turn to the wrong system. They seek solutions exclusively on the horizontal plane, other people, external circumstances, manipulation of material conditions, when the vertical connection remains available and unexplored. It would be like a telephone hub trying to solve all its problems by talking to other secondary hubs, completely ignoring the existence of the matrix. Behrend establishes that if human beings referred their difficulties in the same confident manner to the source from which they were projected and used the resources it provides, they would accomplish what Jesus indicated when he said, "Ask, and you shall receive." Every need would be met. The matrix can't abandon its extensions. The trunk of the tree can't stop providing for its branches, unless the branch considers itself separate and cuts itself off from the flow. This perceived separation constitutes the only real disconnection. The universal mind doesn't withdraw. The connection doesn't deteriorate over time. The supply doesn't diminish. What changes is the individual consciousness that starts operating as if it were isolated, as if it needed to conquer through its own effort what already belongs to it by nature. Behrend recounts a case that illustrates the reversal of this perception. A man was about to lose his home in the southern United States. The property was mortgaged to the limit. The creditors were preparing to foreclose. This wasn't just about financial value. It was the house where he had been born and raised, filled with memories and bonds that transcended any dollar amount. The external situation seemed hopeless. The numbers didn't add up. The deadline was running out. Any rational analysis would conclude that the loss was inevitable. The guidance he received was this: the power that brought him into existence did so with the purpose of expressing its unlimited supply through him, not partially, not conditionally, unlimited. No power on earth, no creditor, no bank, no economic circumstance could cut him off from his source. Except for one single factor, his own consciousness. If he maintained the consciousness of separation, of scarcity, of being a victim of circumstances, he would effectively be cutting himself off from the flow, not because the source abandoned him, but because he would refuse to receive, like a telephone hub that disconnects its own line and then complains that the matrix doesn't answer. The instruction was to re-establish the connection internally. Hold the image of the house being preserved. Recognize that the necessary supply already existed in the universal substance, waiting only for an open channel to manifest. The following week, before a lecture at the Selwyn Theatre, a note arrived from this man. I want you to know that I'm the happiest man in all of New York. My home in the South is saved. The money came in the most miraculous way. Behrend doesn't detail the specific means by which the money arrived, and that's deliberate. The channels vary infinitely. The source remains singular. To fixate on the channels would be like the secondary hub, demanding that help come through a specific cable, refusing any other means of transmission. Behrend emphasizes something additional about the nature of this power. It doesn't stand out. Everything that's animate or inanimate comes into existence through a creative intelligence that remains invisible. The spiritual substance that originates every projected form doesn't appear separately from its creation. It projects the substance of itself, which becomes a solidified counterpart of itself, while remaining imperceptible to the physical eye. You won't see the universal mind operating. You won't find the undifferentiated substance floating in space, waiting for instructions. The invisible remains invisible, even while producing visible results. To demand to see the power before using it would be like demanding to see electricity before flipping the switch. Electricity remains invisible. The light turns on. Your individual mind isn't trying to connect with something distant. It's already connected. The line was never cut. The main hub never went offline. The only variable remains your awareness of this connection and your willingness to use it. If the mechanism works with the precision of law, why do so many people visualize without getting results? Why do some form mental images for years and remain exactly where they started? Behrend addresses this question directly. The only reason the mental image doesn't always materialize lies in the introduction of something antagonistic to the fundamental principle. The system has no defects. The universal substance has no manufacturing flaws. When manifestation doesn't occur, the problem is with the operator. The most common destructive element turns out to be surprisingly simple: the frequency with which images are changed. Observe the pattern. Someone decides they want their own business. They visualize the store, the customers, and the activity. 2 weeks later, an apparently good job opportunity comes up. The image changes. Now they visualize the corporate career, the promotion, and the office with a view. A month later, a friend proposes a partnership in another field. New image. 3 months later, frustrated because nothing has materialized, This person concludes that visualization doesn't work. But it worked perfectly. Each time an image was replaced, the universal substance interrupted the process of materializing the first one to begin the second. When the second was swapped for the third, the same thing happened. The result? 3 processes started, none completed. 3 molds are partially filled, none are finished. After many changes, people often decide that the original desire was the true one. They return to the first image, and then the question arises: if this was the first image, why hasn't it materialized yet? Because the plate was exposed multiple times. Behrend offers an analogy that clarifies the mechanism. The substance you're dealing with mentally is more sensitive than the most sensitive photographic film ever produced. Imagine that, while taking a photograph, you suddenly remembered having already used that same plate for another photo. Would you expect a perfect result? Obviously not. The 2 superimposed images would produce an unrecognizable mess. In the same way, upon discovering 2 photos taken unconsciously on the same plate, no sensible person would condemn the principle of photography. No one would declare that cameras don't work, or that light is incapable of impressing sensitive surfaces. The conclusion would be pragmatic. An operational error was made. Just start over, put in a new plate, resolve to be more careful. Following this procedure, a satisfactory result becomes a matter of time. The same applies to the mental image. The principle isn't in question, its application is. When you repeatedly change the mold offered to the universal substance, you can't expect a defined form as the result. Recognize the mistake, clear the plate, start again with renewed determination, and this time keep the image stable. But there's a second obstacle that sabotages results even when the image remains constant. Desires are delayed or distorted through a specific misuse of the power, the thought that realization depends on certain people or conditions. I'll get this job if the manager likes me. My business will prosper when the economy improves. I'll find the ideal partner if I go to the right places. Each of these formulations contains a subtle poison. It subordinates the creative principle to external circumstances. It makes the universal mind dependent on factors that it itself should create. Behrend is categorical. The originating principle doesn't depend on any person, place, or thing. It doesn't require favorable conditions. It doesn't need permission from the market, from your family, from your boss, or from any other external authority. The law establishes that the originating creative principle of life is the universal here and the eternal now. It creates its own vehicles through which it operates. When you hold the image of prosperity without specifying that it must come through a particular job, a particular person, or a particular circumstance, you open space for unexpected channels to manifest. When you tie the image to specific conditions, you artificially limit a power that has no natural limits. Past experience has no relevance to the present image. The fact that you've failed before tells you nothing about what will happen now. The fact that others have failed in similar situations doesn't set a precedent for your manifestation. The principle operates in the eternal present. It doesn't check your history. It doesn't verify your background. It responds to the current mold with the same availability as if it were the first mental image ever formed in the universe. What's the right feeling to cultivate? Behrend indicates precisely. The thing or consciousness you desire should feel like something normal and natural, part of you, a form of personal evolution that's already underway, not something distant to be conquered, not a prize to be earned, not an unlikely exception that might happen if everything conspires in your favor. The feeling should be one of belonging. In the same way that you don't question whether your next heartbeat will happen, you simply assume it's part of how you function, the object of visualization should occupy that same space of naturalness. With this feeling established, no power can prevent the realization of the image held in your mind. not because you've defeated opposing forces, but because there never were any real opposing forces. Only internal resistances are projected outward and confused with external obstacles. The obstacle was always internal, the solution is too. Principles remain abstract until they're tested in the furnace of personal experience. Anyone can theorize about the power of thought. Few submit the theory to the laboratory of their own life with enough rigor to produce evidence. Genevieve Behrend did exactly that. And the first test that life presented her with was financial. The situation was this. Behrend had discovered the writings of Thomas Troward, the English judge whose Edinburgh lectures articulated with extraordinary precision the principles of mental science. She immediately recognized that she was in the presence of a master, not someone who repeated second-hand formulas, but a mind that had penetrated the foundations of creative power and could transmit them with clarity. Troward lived in England. Behrend lived in the United States. To study personally with him, and she knew she needed this direct transmission, she would have to cross the ocean and stay indefinitely in another country. Her income, though sufficient for daily necessities, didn't seem to allow for such an undertaking. By conventional calculations, the trip was unviable. $20,000. This was the amount needed to carry out the plan with security. In 1914, a considerable sum. For someone without accumulated savings, without an inheritance in sight, and without obvious financial connections, the number seemed to belong to another universe of possibilities. But Behrend had read Troward. She had memorized a specific paragraph from his lectures. My mind is a center of divine operation, and divine operation means expansion into something better than has existed before. From the Edinburgh lectures, she had also extracted an initial understanding of the law of attraction and obtained a rudimentary notion of visualization. The question that presented itself was direct. Did the principles work or not? There was only one way to find out. Before even investigating whether Troward accepted private students, a detail most people would consider the logical first step, Behrend began applying the principle. Every night, before going to sleep, she formed the mental image of the $20,000 she needed. The procedure was specific. It wasn't about vaguely wishing for the money or hoping it would somehow appear. She saw the bills. She counted them mentally, $20,000 bills, passing one by one through her imaginary hands in the room where she slept. Every night, the same ritual, the same count, the same precise image. To impress even more deeply on her mind that this money was destined for a specific purpose, she added layers to the visualization. She mentally wrote out the complete picture. She saw herself buying the ship ticket. She saw herself walking along the deck, watching New York disappear on the horizon as the vessel headed for London. She saw herself arriving. She saw herself being accepted as Troward's student. The image wasn't one of abstract desire. It was an accomplished fact. And then came the turning point. One day, walking down the street while practicing deep breathing exercises, a thought emerged in Behrend's consciousness with unusual clarity. My mind certainly is a center of divine operation. If God fills all space, then God must be in my mind too. If I want this money to study with Troward, to know the truth of life, then both the money and the truth must be mine, even though I can't feel or see the physical manifestation of either. From another channel in her brain, she describes it this way. An answer seemed to come. Of course, that's it. Everything must have its beginning in the mind. The I, the idea, must be the only and primary substance that exists. And that means money just as much as everything else. What happened in that instant wasn't intellectual understanding. Behrend already understood the principle intellectually. She had read about it, memorized paragraphs, and practiced visualization. What happened was different. Something changed in the quality of her perception. Her mind accepted the idea not as an interesting theory, but as an operational fact. Immediately, all tension of mind and body relaxed. There was a feeling of absolute certainty, not hope, not cautious optimism, certainty of being in contact with all the power that life has to give. The doubt that operates in the background, even during the most disciplined visualizations, simply dissolved. Berend doesn't report having done anything else extraordinary after that moment. She doesn't describe heroic efforts, complex negotiations, or dramatic reversals. What she reports is simple. After about 6 weeks, she had the $20,000 she needed in her bank account. The specific channels through which the money arrived, she doesn't detail extensively in Your Invisible Power. And this omission is instructive. The principle doesn't operate through a single predictable channel. Manifestations rarely arrive by the path the rational mind anticipates. To overspecify the how would miss the central point. The universal substance creates its own vehicles. What Berend demonstrated through her personal experience was the complete operational sequence. Clear identification of the desire, formation of a specific mental image, disciplined sustaining of that image through daily practice, and then, crucially, the transition from intellectual understanding to deep acceptance. The moment when the idea stopped being something she thought and became something she was. The money followed, not as a mystical reward, as a consequence of law operating through a mind that had finally aligned with it without reservations. Troward accepted her as a student. She crossed the ocean. She studied with the master, and she later spent decades transmitting what she had learned and proven. Visualization operates through images. But there's a second instrument of creation that works in parallel, amplifying or sabotaging everything the mental image builds: the word. Berend reveals a principle that most people completely ignore. In every word used, there's a germ of power that expands and projects in the direction the word indicates, finally developing into physical expression. Words aren't neutral sounds that describe reality. They're creative forces that shape it. Consider the mechanism. When you want to experience the consciousness of joy, the procedure is specific. Repeat the word joy secretly, persistently, and emphatically. Not once, not casually. With concentrated intention, multiple times, allowing the internal sound to reverberate throughout your entire being. What happens? The repetition of the word establishes a particular quality of vibration. This vibration causes the germ contained in the word to begin expanding. The expansion continues projecting outward until your entire being fills with that quality. You're not pretending joy, you're cultivating it through its vibrational germ. This principle operates regardless of the content of the word. It works for joy, but it works equally for fear, scarcity, illness, and failure. Every word repeated with sufficient intensity plants its specific germ and nourishes its corresponding growth. Most people spend their entire day repeating words, out loud or in silent internal dialogue, without the slightest awareness that they're sowing and watering future realities. What words have you been repeating to yourself this week? Troward, Berend's mentor, teaches that the mental faculties always work under something that stimulates them. This stimulus can come from two sources. The first comes from outside, through the external senses, something you see, hear, touch, or experience in the material world. The second comes from within, through the consciousness of something not perceptible on the physical plane. Most people only know the first source. They react to their environment. They respond to circumstances. They allow the external world to dictate their internal content. When the environment presents something pleasant, they feel good. When it presents difficulties, they fall apart. They live like leaves in the wind, moved by forces they don't control. Recognizing the second source, the internal stimulus, completely transforms this dynamic. When you understand that you can bring any desired state into consciousness regardless of external conditions, you stop being a victim and become a creator. You don't need to wait for the world to give you permission to feel abundance, peace, power, or joy. You can cultivate these states internally through the repeated word and the sustained image. Once something feels normal to you, not extraordinary, not exceptional, not an unlikely stroke of luck, but simply normal, that something becomes your property through the law of growth and attraction, as surely as the ability to add became your property after you learned the use of numbers. No one questions whether they'll be able to add 2 plus 2 tomorrow. It became part of who you are. The method of repeating the word works the same way. It makes the word, in all its unlimited meaning, permanent personal property. Because words are the embodiment of thoughts, and thought is creative, not good or bad in itself, simply creative. It creates according to its nature, regardless of moral judgments about the content. The foundation of scientific prayer rests on a specific statement. Ask, believing that you have already received, and you shall receive. The instruction only seems paradoxical on the surface. How do you believe you've already received something you clearly don't yet possess? The confusion dissolves when you understand a fundamental principle. Everything has its origin in the mind, and what you seek externally already exists internally at the moment you can think it. No one can think a thought in the future. Every thought happens now. The thought of a thing constitutes its origin. Therefore, the thought form of the desired thing already belongs to you the instant you can conceive it. You're not trying to attract something distant. You're recognizing something that already belongs to you on the causal plane, even though it hasn't yet densified on the physical plane. The constant recognition of this thought possession produces a specific effect. It makes the thought concentrate more and more, condense progressively, and project with increasing definition until it finally takes on tangible physical form. Prayer, understood in this way, isn't a plea to an external entity. It's the deliberate use of the law that governs manifestation. This deliberate use confers something Behrend calls the power of dominion. Dominion over what? Over everything that tends in any way to prevent your perfect freedom, limiting circumstances, parasitic thoughts, inherited fears, repetitive patterns. None of these have any power of their own, except what you grant them through attention and belief. Life was given to be enjoyed more and more fully, not endured, not survived, enjoyed and expanded. The constant recognition of this truth, through sustained image and repeated word, makes you what Behrend calls a prince of power, not through an externally granted title, through an internally recognized nature. Intellectual understanding illuminates the path. Consistent practice walks it. Behrend accessed the meditative state every night, that internal silence where the mental image gains clarity and the will stabilizes. There, in the dark room, she counted her $20,000 bills while the noise of the day dissolved. Most people have never learned how to reach that state on their own. We've developed audio tools precisely for this, to guide your mind to the point where visualization operates without interference. To learn more and get immediate access, click the link on the screen or in the comments. If this video made sense to you, write in the comments, "It made sense to me."